Well, here's the title page of what was originally called politely Lucrece, and which I prefer too, because after all, when I'm gathering images for PowerPoints and typing in Rape of Lucrece into Google, you can just imagine. Or if I have to explain to people, well, I'm trying to figure out, because of the authorship question, who's responsible for the Rape of Lucrece, that gets awkward too. But as I say, the 1594 publication of this leads most people to try desperately to explain what is this poem doing coming out. There are so many enigmas about it, and therefore focus on the Southampton dedication and matters of 1594. I'm actually first more interested in trying to figure out what was the impetus behind this poem and its origin. What was the motivation for Shakespeare writing this? And in the style that he does too. And then other questions, why is it a poem? That gets pretty desperate among the scholars. The two main Ovidian narrative poems that Shakespeare writes, 1593, Venus and Adonis, and 1594, The Rape of Lucrece, people wonder, oh, is there some relationship between those? How can we explain why Shakespeare promises to do something more serious in the introduction to the Venus and Adonis? And this seems to be it. And so if you compare the two, what we hear is that Venus and Adonis tells of a woman's lust and Lucrece of a man's. But that's a pretty skimpy explanation for why these two poems are the ones that come out back to back. In Lucrece, a woman famous for chastity is assaulted by a man of excessive pride, which is fine, but these formulas are presented as if we've got another case like the sonnets where we want to detach the work from the life and say that this was more or less a poetic exercise on Shakespeare's part. He just came up with a theory or a formula or a concept and decided to play it out. But does that really make any sense? The grounding in the 1594 publication date is troubling because the style, as I said, is not matching that era. The style is what is called euphuistic, and it's very artificial, over the top, extreme. And euphuism is characterized by alliteration, extreme alliteration, antithesis, balanced sentences, exotic imagery, and it's really noticeably and artificially over-poetic. So you get lines in the poem early on like, muster thy mists to meet the eastern light, or in darkness daunts them with more dreadful sights. And that can be pretty suffocating after a while. Euphuism was seeing its heyday in the 1570s, maybe up to 1580-ish around then. But 15 years later, it seems like it's going to be obsolete. It seems like it was a fad for a time. So that's disturbing too. Here's some more euphuistic constructions from early in the poem, and then for those of you who are not familiar with the plot or the poem much at all, we can go through it more systematically. But essentially what we've got is at the beginning of the work, we plunge right in to this story without a frame. And what we hear is that there are soldiers, Roman soldiers, who in antique, ancient, legendary times are at camp, bragging about how virtuous and lovely their wives are. And one of the tyrannical monarchy, the family in charge, Tarquin, or among the Tarquins, he hears about Collatine's wife, Lucrece, and she sounds good to him. So he sneaks away from camp, and as you see here in the first stanza, he's lust-breathed. He leaves the Roman host because he wants to see for himself this Lucrece the chaste. But the odd thing about that is that's the first stanza, and we plunge right into the story. But the importance of this story, the background of the story really is that this is the catalyst, this Rape of Lucrece is the catalyst, the incident that has Rome chucking out its tyrannical, corrupt monarchy and establishing its republic that it cherishes so much that way down the line we've got Brutus being coerced into a conspiracy with Cassius and others because they're so worried about their republic that when Julius Caesar is gaining power and seeming to be loved by the people, and maybe he'll become the next monarch if he institutes that system, and maybe then becomes tyrannical again. We can't have that. We love our republic so much. We've had it so long, ever since the Rape of Lucrece, that we've got to kill Julius Caesar. So that's the importance of the incident of the Rape of Lucrece, booting out Tarquin and his family from the monarchy. But we get very little of that except in a prose introduction, and when the poem starts, we're plunged right into the plot. So that's odd too. The framework is just not there. The political implications seem not to be there. Well, Tarquin sneaks over to where Lucrece and usually her husband Collatine live, but she's there alone with her servants, and he invites himself in, says he's a friend of the family, and has dinner with her, and observes her and considers her. And you hear a lot of this kind of euphuistic, overblown, poetic exusions. This earthly saint adored by this devil little suspected the false worshipper, for unstained thoughts do seldom dream on evil. Birds never limed, no secret bushes fear. So guiltless she securely gives good cheer and reverend welcome to her princely guest, whose inward ill no outward harm expressed. Inward ill, outward harm, earthly saint adored by this devil. We like these antitheses, these balanced sentences. The poet's zeal for this kind of euphuistic style is difficult to miss. Here's a passage describing a moment from later this evening that he is visiting her. And now this lustful lord leaped from his bed, throwing his mantle rudely over his arm, is madly tossed between desire and dread. The one sweetly flatters, the other feareth harm. It's expressive poetry, and Shakespeare received high praise for this even in the 1590s, but it's going to probably strike some originally, and certainly us, as a kind of a gimmicky, artificial style. Not as subtle as the mature Shakespeare. Here's another euphuistic passage with the balance, the antithesis, the alliteration, but also this exotic imagery, too, that euphuism loves. Concerning Tarquin's internal struggle into a figure from horticulture. What is this? As corn overgrown by weeds, so heedful fear. And so it seems like you go to more and more extreme images or notions and then try to bring it back to its relevance to the scene. As corn o'ergrown by weeds, so heedful fear is almost choked by unresisted lust. Away he steals with open listening ear, full of foul hope and full of fond mistrust, both which, as servitors to the unjust, so cross him with their opposite persuasion, that now he vows a league and now invasion. So, for, again, the work praised for its dramatic qualities, why wasn't this written as a play in the first place? And don't say it's because it's, too disturbing when you consider Titus Andronicus. Well, in this early part of the poem, maybe about the first half of the poem, we keep hearing about what people have been chatting, I see, about the red and the white, which I just couldn't decide on tonight because that seems to be characteristic of the poem too. We keep hearing about these two colors associated with Lucrece, this paragon of virtue. First, very early on in the first stanzas, where Collatine unwisely did not let up to praise the clear unmatched red and white which triumphed in that sky of his delight. In what way is red and white, or the combination red and white, intrinsic to Lucrece? Well, once lust-breathed Tarquin actually visits her, we keep hearing about this red and white. And yeah, people are getting it right on the chat there, the red and white Tudor colors. But you keep hearing it again and again, encoded in the play, I think. Well was he welcomed by the Roman dame, that is Tarquin, first setting his eyes on Lucrece. Well was he welcomed by the Roman dame, within whose face beauty and virtue strived, which of them both should underprop her fame. When virtue bragged, beauty would blush for shame. White and red implied there, and then practically given. When beauty boasted blushes in despite, virtue would stain that ore with silver white. Here's another extreme euphuistic image, also on the red and white theme, though, looking at Lucrece's face. This heraldry in Lucrece's face was seen, argued by beauty's red and virtue's white. Of either's color was the other queen, the sovereignty of either being so great that oft they interchange each other's seat. So, what are we talking about here in terms of the poetry in this fancy Shakespearean language? Really just, she's blushing. And the symbolism of red being more about living beauty and passion, and virtue's white being the purity, but not to the extreme that there's no red. That is, she's not dead, she's not sepulchral. That is dramatized too. Even her blushing is dramatized as a kind of a war, or an interchange at the very least. But more so in that stanza, we're hearing another kind of language too. Heraldry in her face, when you're talking about red and white. Of either's color was the other queen, sovereignty of either being so great that oft they interchange each other's seat. Again and again, it's regal language, or the word queen and heraldry and sovereignty is more a political language here in conjunction with the red and white colors. So you keep seeing this again and again, the silent war of lilies and of roses when you're looking at her face, or later on when Tarquin will sneak up on her, he sees her lily hand, her rosy cheek lie under. And as people are pointing out in the chat here, these are in fact the Tudor colors, the wars of the roses. So we've got here an indication that we should be thinking, at least in the back of our minds, of that other paragon of virtue, Queen Elizabeth I, the Tudor rose. And this is because the Tudor dynasty took the previous century's symbols of strife, and that is ever since, as Shakespeare likes to revisit, ever since the deposition of Richard II, factions of that same family fought each other throughout the 1400s. England goes through a terrible time. There is no stability. There's not much culture going on because there's no stability. But at least it gets dramatized later on by Shakespeare as he depicts the Wars of the Roses, which amount to a Lancastrian branch of the family claiming the throne, and symbolized by the red rose, and the Yorkist side of the family symbolized by the white rose. When we kill and malign Richard III, what we can do now, as Henry VII does, is marry the right person and insist that now we've got a marriage of the two lines of the family, the white rose and the red rose, joined together into the Tudor dynasty. And therefore, the Tudor symbol is the variegated red and white rose. And this is especially taking hold with Elizabeth too. So, red and white, at least, I think not even very subliminally, should be cluing us in that we're thinking of this other paragon of virtue other than Lucrece. What about Queen Elizabeth? And at that point, the worry is that, well, if Shakespeare is allegorizing a story from ancient Rome into some kind of political context, then who is he saying is the Tarquin figure, this potential rapist at this point? Who is the real danger here? There are some other indications, though, I think, that he's got Elizabeth in mind. And he obliquely gives a phrase connected to Lucrece by saying, "Oh, happiness enjoyed but of a few." And that sounds rude in this poem, but really he, again, is just talking about the happiness of looking at her face, enjoyed but a few. So few people have gotten that honor. Nevertheless, when Shakespeare refers to Lucrece, thy never conquered fort, he is actually speaking sexually. So I always think it's none of my business about her never conquered fort, but she is married. So what is this? I think it's an intentional Freudian slip or an intentional ambiguity or ambivalence regarding the Virgin Queen. And another connection, therefore, from Elizabeth to Lucrece as a figure. So as I'm starting to think at this point in the first half of the poem, well then, who would be a Tarquin figure? Who would Shakespeare feel is so vile that she needs to be warned about him in this capacity or this allegory? And when you look at what gets said about Tarquin, there are some intriguing statements made that are inappropriate to the antique context of this in ancient Rome. Oh, shame to knighthood. There's no knighthood in ancient Rome, but there is in Elizabeth's court. He's a martial man. He's part of an entire family that's corrupt. So I want to figure out, possibly at one point, who this would be, if this is true. Tarquin, and one of the interesting things about this poem is that we're often inside his mind as he considers this crime. He wonders, for example, worries about his reputation, which is always a Shakespearean concern, always an Oxfordian concern, which I'll say more about in a moment too. But he wonders, though I die, the scandal will survive if he goes through with this, and be an eyesore in my golden coat. He's talking about his coat of arms. Some loathsome dash the herald will contrive to cipher me how fondly I did dote. So I don't think, from what I know about heraldry, that this is an accurate assessment, that somehow a wart over the left eyebrow of a griffin on your coat of arms means that Grandpa was a rapist. But he does worry about the reputation of it all, and when we start considering, is he going to go through with this or not, we hear, what fond beggar but to touch the crown would with the scepter straight be strucken down? Again, we've got this regal imagery that doesn't seem appropriate to the plot exactly. Thus treason works, ere traitors be espied. This is a potential rapist at this point, not a traitor. But again, Shakespeare is thinking of this allegorically, I insist, and he is thinking of it politically as a crime. All right, so after the first half of the poem, roughly, Tarquin retires to his bedroom, as does Lucrece. And he still considers maybe he should sneak around, sneak up on her, and consider her. He does wander around her estate, and he encounters night-wandering weasels. Why are there weasels hanging around Lucrece's home? Well, one nice thing is that night-wandering weasels, he's one himself in the derogatory sense of weasels. But I think the other interesting little point of interest is for Renaissance England. They're friendly? Yeah. Well, I don't know if they really are, but yeah, instead of cats, they catch the rats. They keep the vermin population down, and they got to be better than cats. They got to be better than Spike, who I just put out in the garage so he wouldn't start squawking at me and mess up, my whole presentation here tonight. So, night-wandering weasels occur, but ultimately, Tarquin does enter Lucrece's bedroom. And here are some later art images of the moment, the key moment where he is ready to attack her. When he comes upon her, she is half-clad and she is asleep, but she does wake up and she recognizes his intention. She pleads with him. There is a brief conversation, but it does not work. Here's another image of just about to be the violent moment and the struggle. And you might keep these in mind visually because I think they relate to something later that Shakespeare gives us, even though those are images from later. Okay, Now, here's the oddity, and here's what Shakespeare. Here's an embarrassment. This poem is considered difficult, not because of the subject matter, but because it just can't be explained. If you purchase, because you want to save $4, the so-called necessary Shakespeare, you will not get this poem, and maybe I forget what else, Two Gentlemen of Verona or something. It's considered not necessary Shakespeare. One of the reasons is that Shakespeare seems to be too young and out of control of his own craft, because what happens next after the rape, discreetly given, but Tarquin steals away into the night, and Lucrece is left there, ashamed and horrified. Takes it out on herself eventually, but she first has these somewhat artificial rhetorical apostrophes where she addresses night with a capital N, or opportunity with a capital O, or time with a capital T. That seems bad enough. But to the tune of a ninth of this entire poem, what happens next is just too bizarre and inexplicable, and another embarrassment. She turns to her own walls and recognizes that there are Trojan War paintings all around, and then we spend time describing scenes from the Trojan War that she sees around her bedroom. Of course, this is bizarre. So from an early point, and in an interdisciplinary capacity, the search may have been on at one time for, is there a possibility that Shakespeare is describing something real? Were there some kind of paintings that existed that match up what we're hearing about in the Lucrece poem by Shakespeare? And about 100 years ago, consensus settled, as far as it can, on some paintings by this artist, Giulio Romano, the only artist Shakespeare does in fact mention in another play. He likes him so much, and it's an anachronistic mention, but he is called that rare Italian master, Giulio Romano, who would beguile nature of her custom. And this is in The Winter's Tale, not set in 16th century Italy. All right, so we're on the track of this artist Shakespeare likes, who may be responsible for what we're getting described in the Lucrece poem. What we hear is, how does Shakespeare know what he knows about Giulio Romano? The author of The Winter's Tale would have had to have learned that Giulio Romano was a sculptor by reading the original Latin epitaphs on the tombstone at Mantua, because this was not known at all about this artist at the time in England or elsewhere. So our travels of the mind take us to Mantua. And what we hear elsewhere is, if anybody went to Mantua, no courtier of the court of Elizabeth I traveling in Italy would have failed to visit the tomb of Baldassare Castiglione, author of The Courtier. The tomb of Castiglione, designed by Romano, was in Mantua. Okay, maybe that's perfectly fine. But of course we know Shakespeare of Stratford, the grain merchant, functionally illiterate, never went to Italy, of course. And we've got the authorship problem again, as from last week. But Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, did go to Italy, so much so in 1575-76 that when he went back to England, he was mocked for being such an enthusiast of Italy, and certainly would have gone to the cultural center that Mantua was. Giulio Romano, the one artist Shakespeare ever mentions in any of his plays, arrived in Mantua from Rome in 1524, personally recommended and escorted by the Gonzaga's cultural agent in Rome, Baldassare Castiglione. And note, too, that Gonzaga, that's a familiar name, recognize that the ending vowel is going to be somewhat of a schwa in Italian, but The Murder of Gonzago, the play within the play, in Hamlet, does seem to be based on some ancient treachery in the Gonzaga family. This would have been who you would have stayed with if you were a courtier or a diplomat and went to Mantua, went to Italy, if you were from a court like Elizabeth I's. It's where de Vere would have stayed if he went to, and he did. And it's not where grain merchants hang out. So here we are, exactly where we want to be. a traveler who was so interested in Giulio Romano that he maybe would have wanted to see his tomb and noted the inscription on it, because how else would he know that Giulio Romano was a sculptor and architect, would certainly, while in Mantua, have gone to the famous Palazzo del Te, built by the artist himself and filled with his paintings and drawings. Exhibited there were Giulio's great pictures of the Trojan War. Now, we're in Shakespeare's Italy, the part he especially likes. If you look at the top of the map there, you've got Venice, Padua, Verona, and Mantua. These are the places mentioned again and again in the Shakespeare plays. Palazzo del Te. Okay, I'm on a mission. I've got to find this place, and I do. Here's the Palazzo del Te by Giulio Romano, architect and artist. Cool. Here is an entranceway into the Palazzo del Te, and realize that anybody growing up in England, especially with artistic sensibilities, whose background amounts pretty much to some paintings of a sanctimonious, pious nature, like Lord Burleigh with a brown background and holding a Bible, and you go to Italy and you see these entranceways where the ceilings are domed and arched and painted, and you get to see images like this painted on the walls inside palazzi. Here is, I don't know, a marriage of gods and mortals and camels and elephants and wine all over the place and naked people, and it is glorious. Of course you're going to be wowed by Italy. Here is Giulio Romano, Palazzo del Te, the Hall of the Giants. And indeed, Romano knows where stress points are architecturally, where the breaking points are. He does a little trompe-l'oeil disguising of the doorway there cleverly, and certainly these are way more active, engaging, compelling than anything you're going to see in England artistically at the time. It's suggested that maybe there's one more mention in the Shakespeare canon of Giulio Romano. This comes in maybe a corrupt passage of Love's Labour's Lost, where we hear about Cupid, this wimpled, whining, purblind, wayward boy, this senior, junior, giant dwarf, Dan Cupid. Well, in that Hall of the Giants that I just showed you a color image of, there is this image of a figure that Giulio Romano, possibly under the instruction of Raphael, who was his mentor, created and then brought with him to the Gonzagas and then painted onto the walls of the Hall of the Giants. And what has been wondered is if, in fact, that instead of senior junior, that's been a hypercorrection of Signor Junios or Signor Giulio, that is Signor Giulio Romano's giant dwarf, Dan Cupid. But in any case, enough that Shakespeare clearly is enamored of the works of Giulio Romano. Problem was that I was misled, and so I'm trying to learn a bit of Italian in my car on tapes, and I'm trying to Google the Palazzo del Te and get these maps and figure out where's the Hall of Troy in this. I'm not seeing it. Eventually what I discovered was that there was a big mistake. So, first, back to Lucrece. She looks at the walls in her room and sees what Shakespeare calls skillful painting made for Priam's Troy. 1,000 lamentable objects there in scorn of nature, art gave lifeless life. As I say, now, for about a ninth of the poem, we're going to be spending listening to descriptions of these paintings. A piece of skillful painting, I hear from another scholar from over 100 years ago, in the poem Lucrece of the siege of Troy, is described in detail and at considerable length. At Mantua, the painter Giulio Romano, in addition to his renowned paintings at the Palazzo del Te, executed in the castle between 1532 and 37. Hold on! Wait a minute. In addition to his paintings at the Palazzo del Te, he executed in the castle a famous series of paintings of the Trojan War. So I'm not supposed to be at the Palazzo del Te. This is another estate owned by the Gonzaga family on the north side of Mantua instead of the south side of Mantua. This is the Palazzo Ducale. A famous series of paintings of the Trojan War, the wonders of which may have been described to the young Shakespeare and may have impressed themselves on his imagination. So as I said last week, Shakespeare got everything he knew. Shakespeare got everything he knew at the Mermaid Tavern, where sailors came in and described how somehow they got into the Palazzo Ducale of the Gonzaga family and into their armory where they could see these glorious Trojan War paintings of Giulio Romano. They snuck back out, back to England, and downing a few margaritas could not help but describe their beauties. Shakespeare, overhearing this, realized, this is so good that I'm hearing this second or third hand that I've got to run home and ruin my poem that I'm currently in the middle of. I think this woman just got raped, but no matter, we got to go to the walls. All right, so now where am I? Palazzo Ducale. Here we go. Not as glorious maybe architecturally, but that's all right because I got to get here. Sala di Troia. There are 2 doorways on the sides. There are little paintings above those which I think are especially important. And the ceiling, all the walls are covered with these glorious paintings. So good. All right, check it out. Now, this room has been suspected of being an armory for the Gonzaga family. I think that makes sense because the paintings go down only so far. And then you've got this space where you might have had pegs for hanging your armor, or you might have had cabinets for storing what you need without interfering with the images. Here's another image. These things are only coming to light now recently because I was relying for a long time on black and white images from a book from the 50s. And what I want to do now is switch into this story that Lucrece is reading on her walls. It's the Trojan War story. A lot of you probably know this from classical mythology. But the importance here is that Shakespeare seems to be teaching us, how do you read ancient myths? How do you read ancient stories, and what do you do with them? What you do with them is apply them, as we'll see. So like Lucrece, who will apply the story that she sees on her walls to her own situation, I think we're invited here to consider the Lucrece story and apply it to our current situation. That is, especially if we are Queen Elizabeth in the 1580s, 1590s, somewhere. Here in somewhat chronological order, because we don't get the full story, but here in somewhat chronological order is the first image. When I first saw this, I thought, oh, the Trojan War, this is Paris and Helen going on. No. Very quickly, you look at this and realize, who is that goddess holding the hand of that Eros or Cupid figure? It's got to be Aphrodite, or later Venus. And is she escorting Paris? No, wait, because that's more like Hermes or Mercury. So what you're actually seeing here is Aphrodite, and then to the right, probably Athena, that goddess, and then somewhat obscured and hidden would be Hera, or later Juno. And the situation prior to the start of the Trojan War is that the parents of Achilles, Peleus and Thetis, when they decide to get married, they want to invite everybody, but, except Eris, who's the goddess of discord. Can we just lose that invitation? So they leave her out, but of course Eris finds out that she's been snubbed this way, and so she decides to create discord by lobbing a golden apple with the inscription "For the fairest" into the proceedings. Hera picks it up and says, an apple for me, inscribed "For the fairest." Athena says, girlfriend, that's mine, "For the fairest." And Aphrodite additionally adds in, no, you're both wrong, it's for me, clearly. All right, now we've got a problem. Goddesses need to vie in a, just like high school, junior high way here, the pageant, and we need someone so stupid that he's going to get involved in this and make a decision and piss off 2 goddesses at the same time. Hey, Paris! So what you're seeing in this image is way over to the left, Paris tending his flocks. The story about Paris, who's a prince of Troy, is that the prophecy was that if he lived, Troy would fall. So Hecuba and Priam, his parents, decided to chuck him out like they did Oedipus and all these other babies you try to get rid of. You don't really want to kill them, but you kind of want them to be pecked at by animals and just get out of the scene. So what happens is always shepherds find these babies in the woods constantly all the time, and there's another mouth to feed, but you got more shepherds. So Paris has been raised unaware of his true lineage and raised as a shepherd, and we decide he's going to be the guy who is so out of it that he'll decide who wins this pageant. The goddesses bribe him. Hera promises him political power, and Athena promises him war strategy, and Aphrodite, of course, promises him the most beautiful woman in the world. And for whatever natural reasons, he picks Aphrodite. Makes some sense, but also now he gets the most beautiful woman in the world. Somewhere in the gap, he finds out he's a prince of Troy, but he goes to visit Menelaus and Helen because, oh yeah, I didn't tell you this, right? She's married. Anyway, he visits her, and depending on the story or version of Helen that you get, she either willingly or, pretty nonchalantly goes away with him. Here on the walls is a non-color image of another Giulio Romano painting in the Palazzo Ducale. It's called Il Ratto di Elena, and it's called The Rape of Helen, in other words. Now, rape means theft or kidnapping. Technically, it's a much more inclusive term at the time. Raptors these days are thieves, birds. Velociraptors in paleontology are dinosaurs that are thieves, or oviraptors are egg thieves. And so rape really can mean just kidnapping or theft. But the disturbing aspect of this poem now is that when Lucrece looks at this image, universally known as the Rape of Helen, what should be her reaction? And it is this, weirdly. Show me the strumpet that began this stir, that with my nails her beauty I may tear. Lucrece's impulse is to take her fingernails and go at the walls and scrape them, hating Helen. Thy heat of lust fond Paris did incur, this load of wrath that burning Troy doth bear. The eye kindled the fire that burneth here, and here in Troy, for trespass of thine eye, the sire, the son, the dame, and daughter die. Why should the private pleasure of some one become the public plague of many more? So, Lucrece's impulse is to attack Helen, seemingly inappropriately, especially because it's called the Rape of Helen. But keep that image in mind, too. Well, the war gets going. The 1,000 ships are launched, and the walls of the Sala di Troia and the Palazzo Ducale are filled with these dramatic images. Giulio Romano, if this isn't just nonsense, is praised for his vitality, illusionism, and theatrical splendor. That's what the art critics say about him. So if there really is something that can be called theatrical splendor in painting, of course, somebody like Shakespeare is going to be attracted to these images. So you do have a lot of tension and drama and twisted horses' necks and people being trampled under mired chariots, the gods intervening and directing issues. A lot of the images that you'll see on the walls here in this hall concern Diomedes, not a major character, not a major player. He's often a sidekick to Odysseus or Ulysses. But in Homer's Iliad, Diomedes does have this one book devoted to him, book 5. It's called an Aristeia, in which he has just a day where he is on fire with ability. You can't stop him. So an Aristeia is the best of. You might have one of these yourself, one of those days where the writing just does it itself, or you can't be beat, or whatever it is. You're just on your game. Diomedes has this, and I think that even though the art historians are saying, no, this isn't the case, it's just arbitrary, that really Giulio Romano is in fact featuring Diomedes again and again, essentially saying to his patrons, the Gonzaga family, commissioning him for all of this, that you guys are modern-day Diomedes, especially here in your armory. So the theme of the Trojan War is a glorification of their arms and abilities that way. Well, eventually, among all these scenes of gods intervening, of Aeneas nearly getting hit by a rock, it includes that day that Diomedes actually is so good that I have to interrupt my class and say, all right, it's quiz time. Can you wound a god or a goddess? And all my students will write down, of course not. They're gods and goddesses. You can't do that. Ah, you didn't read. -5 points. Yes, you can. If you're on your game like Diomedes is, he actually wounds Aphrodite in the hand, and Apollo and Ares are just going to Zeus and saying, you've got to stop this guy. You've got to intervene. He's just going beyond humans' proper place. So here is Aphrodite fainting up before Zeus. Zeus, recognizable by his symbol, the eagle. And we go back to the battlefield where other things take place. Like sometimes you just have a stroke and you can't explain it. How does this happen? Well, it's like an invisible goddess pierced you and you drop dead. Little Ajax. There is a key moment in Homer's Iliad where after Achilles, who got his nose out of joint by Agamemnon from a slight early in the work, and decided to take his ball and leave the game and sulk on the hill crying to mommy for about 15 books of this glorious epic of men and warriors. His sidekick Patroclus says, this is your problem. Why can't I get involved in the war? And Achilles agrees, all right, you can wear my armor, you can get involved in the war, but hang back a bit and protect yourself. But Patroclus gets involved in it and ends up being slain by Hector. What you're seeing here in the center of the screen is the dead body of Patroclus, stripped of Achilles' armor, which has been taken away. And this is indeed the turning point of the Iliad and the turning point of the war, as far as Homer is concerned, where because of this death, Achilles utters the war cry and will be back and involved in the war. What gets described by Shakespeare when Lucrece is looking at some image on her wall is this. For much imaginary work was there, conceit deceitful, so compact, so kind, or natural, that for Achilles' image stood his spear. Gripped in an armed hand, himself behind was left unseen, save to the eye of mind. In other words, I got a conference paper when I first discovered this. What are we hearing about? Perhaps there might be other places on the wall in the Sala de Troia, but perhaps in terms of compressing time and space, arising out of the death of Patroclus is Achilles, and arising physically above the dead body of Patroclus here is a figure whose face you can't see. His identity is hidden. But what you can see is him shaking a spear or standing behind a spear. So Achilles' image stood, that for Achilles' image stood his spear, may be a reference to that image right there. Why is that important? Well, check this out. For Achilles' image stood his spear gripped in an armed hand, himself behind was left unseen, save to the eye of mind. What I'm saying is, you got an image, a spear shaker, being invisible. Why is that important? Well, as many of you may know, the Earl of Oxford, the main alternate candidate as the most likely person who could have written the works under the pen name of Shakespeare, was honored in Latin in the late 1570s by Gabriel Harvey, who maybe, if translated properly, said something like, thine eyes, and this is to the Earl of Oxford, thine eyes flash fire, thy countenance shakes a spear. And there's been an attempt to say maybe that translates into thy will shakes spears. But in any case, thine eyes flash fire, thy countenance shakes a spear. The implications of when that pen name Shakespeare came into play are at stake. But what often, almost always, gets ignored is the follow-up line to that very utterance. Thy eyes flash fire, thy countenance shakes a spear. Who would not swear that Achilles had come to life again? So Gabriel Harvey is saying to Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, that you are a modern-day Achilles and a spear shaker. So we go back to that, thinking about that image then. If Oxford is in the room, the Sala di Troia, and the other theory is that if it's not an armory, or maybe it's both, that it would be a guest room for people staying with the Gonzagas. In other words, if Edward de Vere woke up in the morning and before brunch had time to look around at the walls, and had been called a modern-day Achilles, or eventually would be, and identified with that figure, and then we've got an invisible arm and a spear shaking, doesn't that all come together in a lovely, lovely way? Doesn't he naturally identify then with Achilles here? Well, in any case, here are some more images from the walls that he may have been seeing. Achilles, Homer seems not to have remembered, should be invulnerable, shouldn't need armor. But his mother gets Hephaestus to carve some new armor, create some new armor for him. And even above the doorway, one of the two doorways in the Sala di Troia, is this important image. Homer spends a lot of time describing the two cities that Hephaestus creates in the shield of Achilles. So, again, on the walls that ostensibly Lucrece is looking at, he gets his new armor, Achilles does, goes back to the war, and then it gets kind of choppy, and we're missing some moments. But the next image that we get on the walls from Giulio Romano is this. I first looked at this image and thought, so here is Odysseus describing how we're going to plot our way into Troy. We're going to build this horse, hence the scaffolding, and then I looked at it for a little while longer and realized that doesn't make any sense. Why not? What is really going on with that scaffolding? Who is that really saying what to whom? Because they all look so baffled. Well, what's actually happening here is that this is Sinon. The Greeks decided to pull this strategy at the behest of Odysseus. Why don't we just say really loud one time, boy, this war has been going on for 10 years and I really miss my dog. I'm going home. Yeah, me too. Thump, 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 thump. They all get in their ships and scurry away. They go behind an island and peer out from the bushes and see what's going on. The Trojans say, hooray, we're free, and they throw open their gates and they all go out and they meet this Sinon character who claims he was left behind by the Greeks. He hates the Greeks. Oh, Odysseus, I spit on him. And all the Trojans say, yeah, we hate him too. What do you got to say? So Sinon, left intentionally by the Greeks to tell their story, says, well, this big horse they built, I know, kind of weird, right? But anyway, if you bring that into your city will be invulnerable. And the Trojans say, awesome. Except it doesn't fit, so they kind of have to tear down their walls, and that's what you're seeing here on this image. Sinon then goes on to tell them that, actually more incidents take place that should have given the Trojans a clue about this. As they're wheeling the horse towards the wall, they hear some noise from inside, some clanging of armor or something. And in Virgil's Aeneid, which tells the end of the Trojan War in a way that Homer's Iliad does not, we hear that Aeneas said, you know what, we should have opened up that horse or something, but we just didn't. So they hear stuff going on inside this hollow horse, oh God, the potholes around here are terrible. And somebody else, shut up. No, you shut up. They're going to hear us. Shut up. I totally mean it. Cassandra is a princess of Troy, and she is a seer. She reads omens and she knows the truth and she prophesies and always tells the truth. But her curse is that she's never believed. And so this is the current day Cassandra complex. Probably most of us have that complex when you just know, oh, this is not going to work out. Please listen to me. And it doesn't work out and nobody listens to you. So Cassandra comes down and says, please, dear Lord, do not wheel that horse into the city. And all the Trojans essentially must be thinking, all right, this is Cassandra. She's a seer. She always knows the truth. And she's saying, do not wheel the horse into the city. But wait a minute. You know, she's never believed. Right, so wheel the horse into the city. Hold on, says Laocoon. Please, for the dear Lord, do not wheel the horse into the city. And Poseidon, who hates Troy, and everybody knows it, sends a sea serpent to swallow him up before he says too much, and often art depicts the swallowing up of the two sons of Laocoon's too by the sea serpent. So, 400 indications that you should not, please, wheel that bloody horse into the city. But they tear down their walls, and they do. And as you know, soldiers come out of the horse at night. Because another good idea is we should all get drunk in celebration, everybody. And the Greeks come out of the horse at night, slaughter everyone, and burn Troy to the ground. Now, because Sinon is so instrumental in the downfall of Troy, we get some commentary in the Shakespeare poem once again. And Lucrece looks at his image, and we are in her mind when she thinks this. The well-skilled workman this mild image drew for perjured Sinon, whose enchanting story the credulous old Priam after slew. It cannot be, quoth she, that so much guile, and she, Lucrece, would have said, can lurk in such a look. But Tarquin's shape came in her mind the while. Look how listening Priam wets his eyes to see these borrowed tears that Sinon sheds. Priam, why art thou old, and yet not wise? Here, all enraged, such passion her assails, that patience is quite beaten from her breast. She tears the senseless Sinon with her nails, comparing him with that unhappy guest, whose deed hath made herself detest. See what's going on here? She's saying that she's looking at the walls, she's seeing a traitor, and she recognizes that although he's got fair looks, that's no guarantee, because Tarquin, moments ago. And this time, her impulse may have been to go after Helen on the walls with her fingernails, but this time she does it. She sees Sinon, and she attacks her own walls and the paintings and starts scraping at it. On the other doorway, other than the shield of Achilles, is this image. This is Hecuba. And this is out of order. In that, clearly these are better times than after the fall of Troy. This is in fact actually the prophecy or the omen or the vision that she has or the dream that she has, Il Sogno di Hecuba, where she will learn that if Paris lives, Troy will fall. There's something creepy and phallic going on here. There's a nightmare vision going on here. But it's still relatively lucrative times because of what we see. And yet, if you remember those images I showed you earlier of the Rape of Lucrece, this might as well have served as the frontispiece for every edition of the Rape of Lucrece ever since the start. This is exactly how Lucrece is described when Tarquin sneaks up on her. Now, Il Sogno di Hecuba. That first dream of Hecuba, that Paris will be a problem, should bring to mind the other dream or omen or prophecy that Hecuba suffers, which is that she gets a glimpse of what's going to happen here. She and her husband Priam have stashed away their youngest son with a family friend in another town and given him some money for the raising of the boy, given him some of the treasure, thinking that they've seen so many of their sons killed in the Trojan War that maybe one will escape if the worst should ever happen. And, of course, it does. Among the atrocities on the night of the fall of Troy, Hecuba sees her husband, her ancient husband, Priam, king of Troy, slain on the altar of Troy. And Shakespeare is concerned with this. Hamlet wants to hear about this and pause it and ruminate on the importance of that moment. But worse than that, maybe, is that after the fall of Troy, the surviving women are essentially slaves now to the conquering Greeks. At least Hecuba has the comfort of knowing that there is one son who escaped this fate and is safe, until one day, washing Agamemnon's underwear down at the river, she comes upon a dead body washed ashore with a slit throat, realizes that's that son. And something breaks in her, but she still has the wherewithal to call a guard over and say, you know what? There's a family friend in another town. And I used to be queen of Troy. I know where all the hidden treasure is, and there's probably something in it for you. If you can get this guy here and set up a meeting for me in a tent. No spreecast. This has got to be real. I got to be present. And this is actually, in fact, arranged successfully. So Hecuba is able to get this traitor, this murderer, unbeknownst to him that she knows what he has done, into a tent, and gets him to dismiss his guard so she can talk to him alone and whisper this secret about where all the treasure is. And what does she do? And my students will always say, well, she kills him. Yeah, she kills. Of course she kills. Well, no, better. What does she do? Hecuba grabbed him, dug fingers into his lying eyes, dug out the eyeballs from their sockets, and kept digging in manic fury with bloody fingers, scooping the hollows where the eyes had been. In other words, what she did was this. All right, that's the connection between Hecuba and Lucrece. So ultimately, what is this story? In the poem, Lucrece, after this Trojan War interposition, decides she's got to kill herself. The men in her life, like her father and her husband Collatine and others, come around, try to understand what has happened here, what has been so traumatic. She's reluctant to say anything about it. But eventually, she does, in fact, stab herself, and it's clear why this has taken place. Everyone is horrified. And oddly, because this is original to Shakespeare, comes this hero of the establishment of the Roman Republic, Brutus. This is the ancestor of the Brutus we know from Julius Caesar, whose ancestry is called upon to get him involved in the conspiracy and protect the Roman Republic. Out of left field emerges this character, Brutus, who apparently adopted a Hamlet-like antic disposition all along, and then just out of the blue emerges forth as a noble, valuable citizen. He with the Romans was esteemed so, as silly jeering idiots are with kings, for sportive words and uttering foolish things. In other words, he's an allowed fool, like Feste, or the Earl of Oxford in Elizabeth's court. Began to clothe his wit in state and pride, burying in Lucrece's wound his follies show. He gets it together now, and becomes responsible. Now he throws that shallow habit by, wherein deep policy did him disguise, and armed his long-hid wits advisedly, to check the tears in Collatinus's eyes. Thou wronged lord of Rome, quoth he, arise. Let my unsounded self, supposed a fool, now set thy long-experienced wit to school. So in other words, this is another Feste-like figure, maybe, or better yet, a Hamlet-like figure who adopts his antic disposition and pretends to be a fool, but ultimately can come forth as brilliant, or a Prince Hal figure who is dismissed as madcap and irresponsible, but when it counts, can put himself forth and clean up his act. This is the character who removes the knife from Lucrece's body, both in Ovid and now in Shakespeare too. But in Shakespeare, what we hear is the blood traveling when the knife is removed in two directions. The crimson blood circles her body in on every side, who like a late-sacked island vastly stood, bare and unpeopled, in this fearful flood. Now, most women I know don't like being compared to land masses. But we've got a Elizabeth connection here again, in that the body of England is the body of Elizabeth, essentially, in this allegory, perhaps. So, in the end, Brutus offers an encouraging speech to Collatine, the now widowed husband, and drums up an avenging spirit among the other men who vow to escort Lucrece's body through Rome, and so to publish Tarquin's foul offense. And then the Roman people support Tarquin's everlasting banishment, and that's the way the poem ends, somewhat abruptly. So is this poem then an emergency allegory designed to warn Elizabeth somehow? Because here is what I'm saying Shakespeare is teaching us how to do. He's teaching us how to read. There's the Roman story of Lucrece. We saw at the beginning that perhaps there are England applications. And why do we get this long Trojan interjection? Well, we saw the Lucrece connections to Elizabeth with the red and white, at the very least, the paragon of virtue. And then we saw the Lucrece connections with the Hecuba story, where she should be identifying with Hecuba and does physically with the scraping of the nails. We saw the Tarquin connection to Sinon that goes on in Lucrece's own mind. And so the remaining question might be, then where does that apply to the England and Elizabeth story? Who are we to beware so desperately that Shakespeare would want to characterize him as a rapist? I wondered about this for a while. Certainly the Earl of Leicester is no friend to the Earl of Oxford. This is Elizabeth's on-again, off-again favorite and serial killer. But it seems like the Lucrece story also has a more international dimension, so I wondered, is there anybody on the scene in a larger way? There's, the long strung along Prince of France, Alençon, Duke of Alençon. But remember how Tarquin was pleasant in appearance, and that guy just doesn't cut it. He seems like he's too obscure a figure, but Christopher Hatton certainly was hated back when euphuism was in its day, the late 70s and around 1580. And of course, with Hatton, you've got that connection with the lost work of De Vere, the work referred to as De Vere annoyed at the rising of a mean gentleman in court around 1580. And that describes Hatton, who seems to be mocked as the character Malvolio in Twelfth Night. Interestingly, too, when you get that Malvolio character, you get these other Lucrece references. When they pull the plot on Malvolio to plant that supposed love letter from his lady Olivia, he sees it and realizes, oh, the stamp on the letter that's sealing it is her impressure, her Lucrece, which she uses to seal. And then he reads on this letter, ostensibly from the woman he wishes is in love with him. I may command where I adore, but silence, like a Lucrece knife, with bloodless stroke my heart doth gore. MOAI doth sway my life. So possibly this pleasant conceit of Vere, the Earl of Oxford, discontented at the rising of a mean gentleman in the English court circa 1580, maybe that does connect Hatton with the one that Shakespeare in around 1580 might be warning Elizabeth about. On the other hand, the real vitriol goes to his own cousin Henry Howard and that batch, who, when Oxford found out, were serious. They weren't just dabbling in Italian art and Catholicism. They were serious in wanting to join a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and get a Catholic on the throne. Oxford ratted them out, and then they turned and accused him of everything under the sun, including saying that the Queen had a bad singing voice. And, demonology and plots to murder everybody and all kinds of endless crimes. He hated this cousin, And those people, and in fact, like the Tarquin family, he hated the whole family of them and declared them the worst reptiles under the sun. Well, ultimately, it doesn't really matter, I suppose, who Oxford is trying to warn about. But I would say this, the question has come up, or I've posed the question, why is this a poem instead of a drama? And I wonder if, in fact, it's because Oxford doesn't have access to his players, can't prepare a play as he's normally doing for the Queen. And why would that be? Is this prison literature, in other words? When he ratted out those conspirators, and Elizabeth characteristically didn't know what to do and went back and forth, it might have turned out okay, except it quickly came to light that Oxford had impregnated one of her ladies in waiting, and this is Anne Vavasor, probably a version of the Dark Lady. And Elizabeth freaked out, as she always did when this kind of thing happened in her court, and threw them all in jail. So I wonder if Oxford is, as always, thinking of Elizabeth as his audience, as his main reader, but he doesn't have access to his players anymore, and so this drama comes in this format. In the end, I think this connection, the Earl of Oxford and Queen Elizabeth, is not only key, but the supreme creative motivation in all these works. Baldassare Castiglione, who I mentioned before as the guy who brought Giulio Romano to the Gonzagas and also wrote the guidebook for the courtier, essentially gave the Earl of Oxford his job description. And in the book of the courtier, he says this is what you've got to do for your monarch. I think that the aim of the perfect courtier is so to win for himself the favor and mind of the prince whom he serves, and Elizabeth liked to be known as the prince. She liked to play that gender ambiguity card. That he may be able to say, and always shall say, the truth about everything which is fitting for the prince to know, without fear or risk of giving offense thereby, and that when he sees his prince's mind inclined to do something wrong, he may be quick to oppose and gently to make use of the favor acquired by his good accomplishments, so as to banish every bad intent and lead his prince into the path of virtue. Certain it is that man's mind tends to the best end, who purposes to see to it that his prince shall be deceived by no one, shall hearken not to flatterers or to slanderers and liars, and shall distinguish good and evil, and love the one and hate the other. And I think these are the principles and the sense of his own purpose that Oxford earnestly and honorably and artistically sought to carry out. Thanks. That's what I've got to say about the Lucrece poem, I think. And now I'm happy to shift to some of the questions I've seen zipping on by. I'm a little bit click shy over there because that's what I hit last time and lost myself for a week. But does anybody want to pose any questions, especially if you're willing to come on camera and get my attention that way? Did Oxford warn Elizabeth about Howard? Howard became a favorite of James and got his revenge on Oxford. Yeah, you know, Howard, especially through Robert Cecil, was not eliminated from court. But both Arundel and Southwell, the other conspirators, proved themselves to be traitors, one of them zipping on over to Spain and swearing allegiance to Philip and then essentially never being heard of again. Good riddance. But Howard slithered his way back in through the hideous, soulless, black-hearted Robert Cecil. I need to accept third-party cookies into my browser in order to comment using this social plugin. It says here. I wonder what that is, but the cookies part sounds delicious. So do I not have the capacity to see people who are willing to camera themselves? I don't know. Zoom chat. Do I think Venus and Adonis was also written about this time, 70s, 80s? You know, I suspect stylistically that that was. Oh, I am frozen now too. Can I be seen? Okay, I'm unfrozen at the moment. Good. I think that I've got my recent article published in Brief Chronicles about the lyric poetry, the development of lyric poetry from the early days when Oxford is most influenced by Chaucer and his own uncle, the father of the wretches here, the original Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, that that evolution brings about a kind of a split that it carries on in the tradition of lyric poetry, but more and more lyric poetry becomes about characters and their own voices. And when Oxford simultaneously is doing these early plays, these dramatic, overblown, famous victory type plays, when he finally weds the lyric poetry and the theater, that's when he becomes Shakespeare. So I think that lyric poetry impulse is, in fact, an earlier one, including Venus and Adonis. Great lecture. As you know, it can be interpreted as reflecting the relationship between Oxford, Southampton, and Elizabeth Trentham. Do you think both interpretations can be valid? This is when I first presented this. This is one of my first conferences, and a lot of the questions were, oh, right, 1594, why do you think this is coming out in 1594? And I did not know enough at the time about why I would be asked that question, and it is because of the Southampton relationship here. And that does, in fact, make a lot of sense. So if you want to think about the importance of Southampton, what I'm saying about the Prince Hal, the Hamlet, and this Brutus character, if those in your mind are all originally earlier versions of plays and poems where the Earl of Oxford is thinking of himself, and then in the later incarnations of these is thinking about the Earl of Southampton, I can see that working and making the case. What else am I seeing here? Do I have any thoughts about why Shakespeare went from 6-line stanzas in Venus and Adonis to 7-line stanzas in Lucrece? I don't know this, except that, again, I think he is in an earlier experimental phase. And wasn't it, am I right about this? Wasn't it the Lucrece stanza format that got Loney connected to the EO poems in one case? But in any case, it's similar to Rhyme Royal, which Shakespeare gets from Chaucer, a slight variation on that. But again, I think in the early days he is experimenting quite a bit, not just with formats in his lyric poetry, but also in voices and character. And eventually he'll imbue the plays with the lyric poetry and come up with, the English Renaissance. He'll come up with Shakespeare. Gabriel Harvey was a blabbermouth. Sprezzatura. Yeah, Castiglione is all about that sprezzatura, that creation of casualness, even if you have to study it at length. But you want to come off as if everything is perfectly natural, that you're not too zealous about anything, you're not too into it, that you can write, toss off a sonnet now and again, but dear God, don't become an English major, too intense. Other comments? Let me know over here in Chatland if you'd like to join on camera. Well, that's got to be to someone else. Great lecture. As you know, it can be interpreted as reflect. Okay, that one I read. Any other questions or comments? I think here we go. Can I address the importance of time in the poem? Don't really know what to say about that. It certainly is something that Lucrece pronounces about. And that's a good question, because time is going to be the concern both for the original version of this and whatever motivated the publication of it in 1594. Confirm your email. Yeah, I think I've got the camera problem here that I can't see things, and I'm just getting a message saying you need to accept third-party cookies in your browser in order to comment using this social plugin. And that'll only take me till next week when we talk about Winter's Tale. Another weird, probably unnecessary Shakespeare. Jennifer asks, Alan, is there another permission dealie at the top left of the screen, a little Lego-looking thing? I don't dare. There are lines in the poem that describe the paintings in the Partimento di Troia in great detail. This is documentary proof that Shakespeare was there. Certainly seems like it. To me, it's so close, and it just makes no sense that it basically ruins the logic of the poem, Lucrece. So it just cannot be that you're getting this information secondhand or thirdhand and then describing it just because by some rule you decide you have to get some art, you have to get interdisciplinary here, you have to describe some paintings inside a rape poem. It's a MacGuffin. Yeah, exactly. It's the essence of it. And this is where the beloved Harold Goddard, a mid-20th century scholar of Shakespeare, is so impressive. He warns us, when you don't understand Shakespeare and you're a director or you're putting on a production or a movie, don't chuck those bits that make no sense or interrupt the drama. That's where Shakespeare really is. He does not come across in these grandiose iambic pentameter speeches so much as he really hints at the truth in these throwaway lines. People talking about who's the better dog at this frame of Taming of the Shrew, or these lines about going up to the mountaintop and hearing hunter noises in the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, or Benedict and Beatrice taking a side tour in their love discussion and saying, you have to toot your own horn or Don worm your conscience, if it'll let you. These lines that make no sense to anybody always end up leading back as much as anything can to the Earl of Oxford.
Hey.
Hey. Alan.
Can you hear me?
Yes, say something.
Cool.
I can hear you and I can see you.
I just want to come on and say hi. It's really fabulous. It's just like being in one of your presentations at school. Your kids must have a fabulous time because you are so funny and communicative. It's just wonderful. It's just great. And I think I want to congratulate Jennifer on this whole idea of this is a wonderful resource. I think we should be using it much. Not necessarily to have a regular.
Yeah, exactly. I want this to be like a class too. It's kind of distracting, and it seems like it's way more like preparing for theater than it does preparing for a class. Preparing, for theater. Not even preparing for a conference, but more for that than for a class.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping with greater facility in this medium that it will seem to me to be more class-like, because if that's the case, I got tons of stuff. Not just conference presentations and cool images.
Of course. You've got a million of them. Well, I just wanted to say thank you. Wonderful. Sorry I missed it last week. My schedule changed, but I was wondering. Oh, also, Jennifer, are you going to post these eventually so that people that missed, like myself, I missed last week's, I'd love to see it. Will it get posted? Maybe she can't answer at this time, but right. Yes, hoping to do that. Okay, got it. Great. Anybody else want to get on camera and say hi? We'd love to see you, just to see if it works. I'm going to sign off. Although I don't know how to do it. I guess click on camera. Bye, Michael. Chat later.
Bye. Apparently you and I are off kilter in timing. One or both of us are off kilter. Yeah, I I agree. Oh, the 3 second delay. How about a TEDx talk? I only vaguely understand what that is. In fact, coincidentally, from Alan. So, yeah, I'm game. Certainly. Lucrece. That exchange was the most fun I've had all day. Well, good, because I know that you were cleaning a lot of the day, so this was better than cleaning. Okay. Thank you. I will look up stuff on TEDx, Alan and Cheryl. What else to say? Could Michael and Alan please play a duet? Roll out those pianos and get rocking. Unfortunately, in this age of advanced technology, we can't. We cannot play piano together. It seems odd, but looking forward to next week. Lecture? Lecturing? I would never do that. Who am I? We'll work on the piano thing instead. Thank you for people saying it's a great talk and complimenting me on all of this. It did turn into an article. I think it has a few images in it in Brief Chronicles several years ago. And I was quite pleased with this one because no one talks about Lucrece. And I like the interdisciplinary nature of it too, that it joins together the class that I teach in classical mythology with the one I'm normally doing in Shakespeare, and the ones that I'm normally doing, like right now, medieval and Renaissance interdisciplinary arts and humanities courses that I do for that era and the modern world. So you're welcome. Should we date this school a few seconds earlier? I'm not sure. Wonderful talk. All right, now I've got to scroll a bit. Danger, danger, danger. Wonderful talk. How can we have access to the images you used? You know, as I mentioned, I tracked down initially a lot of black and white ones that were really obscure in old art books from like the 1950s and 60s. But these days, if you just Google image, Giulio Romano, Sala di Troia, Palazzo Ducale, you know, really any combination of that. Much of what you see tonight, I just found in the last week because now they're in glorious color. Yeah, those are the key images, and more just keeps showing up. I thought this was going to be completely difficult and sewn up. I understand that you can't actually get into the Sala di Troia, but it doesn't look like that now. It seemed like I was being told there's a hole in the wall, and what you're seeing in those pictures is some camera poking through a hole. But it seems like more is showing up, so I don't think that can possibly be the case. Mantua, I understand, is not a place to be in August, but and Mantua is named after the daughter of Tiresias, another one of these seers, but it's built on a swamp. So I'm frightened of Mantua, I'm afraid, but it still seems to be a key place. Sylvia, hello.
How are you?
Great. How are you?
Fine. The reason I brought up time was because it felt when she was looking at the walls that you were sort of waiting for her cousin to come home, and it was trying to be in real time.
Uh-huh. So that would well, I guess. But it's not even weirder that, you know, we're passing the time before everybody gets around so I can not explain why I'm killing myself. I don't know.
Also, in the
I don't know what I would do.
it was the very center of the poem where she introduces time as a way of finding truth. And I thought about Alan and his center
Oh,
everything theories.
yeah. When I was really starting to develop this presentation, I was not as aware of that palimpsest effect as I am now, and that's why I wouldn't have detected that. But you're right. I should reread this and think about what is being tweaked from some earlier version, because that later concern about time and its powers to obscure the truth is a panic by the later era or the revisions of these works when they're finally emerging. Yeah, so that makes great sense. Thanks.
Sure. See you later.
See ya. Yeah, hoping to find a 360-degree panoramic of the Sala, but it is elusive. Less so now. Sorry about these 3-second delays or disconnects. But advances are made every day in technology, and I'm sure by next week, when we'll be looking at the Winter's Tale, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Let's go to these sites when we go to Italy. Wait a minute, excuse me, who's going to Italy and when is this taking place? And pardon me, I'd better get something out of this. The little Shakespeare in Italy head. A little Shakespeare with a pizza chef's hat on the top of him. What else is happening? All right, here's an advertisement. If anyone's in Los Angeles on Saturday, come hear Earl Showerman speak at the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable. And what is he speaking on? Midsummer Night's Dream. Yeah, that's what he's got going these days. Earl is great, brilliant scholar, excellent presenter, and always exciting with the adrenaline. Michael, save your ducats. What am I saving my ducats for? I should not worry about spending money on a little plastic image of Shakespeare's head with a pizza hat on top of him. Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare's Aristophatic comedy. Right, this is what I heard Earl speak about at the Madison, Wisconsin conference very recently. Save my ducats on Italy, and don't go there? My ducats, yeah, all of them. Italy in 2016. Look for the FB page. I'm embarrassed that I even know that that's an abbreviation for Facebook. What can I say? You'd think that I would know like the basics about that because here I am, my head on a screen, not messing up this week so far, I think. I mean, like pushing the wrong buttons. But I don't understand the Italy thing. Some of us don't care for Facebook. What? Come with us. My theater is presenting all of the Italian plays in the settings that inspired Oxford as per the Rowe book. This is sounding attractive. I'm a wonderful talking head, though. Yes. Oh, I forgot to red and white the whole thing. I tried to like make this so that the red would be showing first and then, haha, but I couldn't do it. So this is the new fashion thing, though, two ties. Although it kind of weirds me out, right? Otherwise, it's all night. All night. No, it's not. Where are we? Paused in there. Right, need to unpause my chat. Well, let me tell you about next week. Why don't I? Why don't I tell us a bit next week? Next week, it's the week before Thanksgiving. It's supposed to be pretty cold here in Pullman, which is in eastern Washington, I believe. I've got a meeting to go to. But more important than that, it'll be The Winter's Tale. This is kind of an obscure play, too, that doesn't see a lot of productions or attention. And the first confusion about this play is maybe the title, The Winter's Tale, needs explanation in the same way that so much about The Rape of Lucrece needs explanation, too. What is this, and why is it called The Winter's Tale? And what you'll hear traditionally is that, well, it's, kind of a dreamy fantasy story that has something to do with what you might hear people tell around the hearth during the winter when they're telling stories with, we don't know, The Winter's Tale. Well, the problem is that it does not take place in winter in the same way that Midsummer Night's Dream doesn't seem to take place in midsummer, and Twelfth Night doesn't make any sense as a title for that play. So Shakespeare must be up to something else with The Winter's Tale as a title. The play actually takes place over a span of 16 years and is primarily set in the springtime when it really does settle down. So that's the first question we've got to ask, and then we've got to wonder, what is this play? I mean, Shakespeare already did a good job on the theme of insane jealousy many times, but especially with Othello. So why does he repeat this story of a husband distrusting his wife, and then why does it take the turns that it does? And finally into this completely unrealistic and baffling fantasy ending that only partially restores our dreamy, better feelings that we had or were hoping to have much earlier in the play. So I got an attempted explanation of that. Again, forbidden Shakespeare studies, because it puts forth the thesis that it's the Earl of Oxford responsible for this. And again, especially with this play, I think, thinking in terms of Elizabeth as the chief recipient of his words.